Up next we have Sarah Ballantyne, and she is a Ph.D. I first came across her, I ran across one of her blogs about gluten intolerance, and I was like, this woman is a superstar. So, this is going to be great. No pressure. All right, so if you didn't already figure out, I fully endorse the use of social media throughout my presentation. My handle is @PaleoMom, just so I can see what you write about me later. And of course, you want to include the hashtag AHS13. Autoimmune disease is a group of approximately 140 suspected and confirmed autoimmune diseases that all have a common pathogenesis. That means a common origin, and that origin is dysfunction of the immune system. The first step is the production of autoantibodies. Autoantibodies are antibodies that our immune system produces that recognize proteins within our own body, as opposed to what they are supposed to recognize, which is proteins in pathogens, in foreign invaders that will make us sick. Now, autoantibody production is an accident that actually happens fairly frequently within our bodies. So our bodies have developed a variety of fail-safe mechanisms for detecting autoantibody production and quashing it before it becomes a problem. In autoimmune disease, those fail-safes fail. You also need stimulation of the immune system to attack. And what that ends up doing is damaging proteins, cells, tissues within the human body. And when enough damage accumulates that symptoms manifest, that's when you have an autoimmune disease. As a general rule, autoimmune diseases are very, very difficult to diagnose. There are some autoimmune diseases with very classic symptoms, but there are others where people go years, if not decades, from specialist to specialist, enduring invasive tests, sometimes medical treatments without a really good rationale before they ever get any kind of answer as to why they feel the way they do. Autoimmune disease affects something like 50 million Americans. It's actually really difficult to estimate the prevalence of autoimmune disease because there have been no broad epidemiological studies to evaluate this. And so these estimates are based on what we know of just the most common autoimmune diseases. And it is likely that saying 50 million Americans is an underestimate. Autoimmune disease is the top cause of chronic illness in the United States, affecting approximately double the number of people who are affected by cardiovascular disease. It is lifelong, there is no cure, and what's really relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today is the incidence is increasing. When you look at any autoimmune disease, the incidence is increasing. Some of them are increasing modestly, and some of them are increasing dramatically. So when you look at this graph, you can see the increase in incidence in multiple sclerosis, Crohn's, and type 1 diabetes over the last 50 years. Now, for any asthmatics out there, asthma is not an autoimmune disease, it's an immune disease, and there's some pathogenic mechanisms in common, which is why it's included on this graph, but don't freak out that you have an autoimmune disease. So I think it's really instructive when we look at a graph like this and look at, okay, incidence has been increasing really dramatically in the last 50 years. What else has changed in the last 50 years? And it's no surprise, I'm sure, to any of you that the incidence of obesity has been increasing similarly dramatically over a similar time scale. The incidence of type 2 diabetes has been increasing similarly dramatically over a similar time scale. Cardiovascular disease is an interesting one because it has been increasing dramatically over a similar time scale. But this graph actually shows the number of deaths due to cardiovascular disease has plateaued and started coming down in the last 30 years. This is often attributed to success in education about the importance of diet and lifestyle in preventing cardiovascular disease. But it's really probably more likely due to advances in medical intervention. We have a lot more ways of saving your life if you have cardiovascular disease than we used to, and there are a lot more procedures done in a lot more centers that are life-saving. And in fact, if you look at hospitalizations for cardiovascular disease during that 30-year time point in which the death rate has come down, hospitalizations are continuing to go up. Now, this is one of my favorite graphs ever. It's from the American Heart Association because it's titled Hospital Discharges for Cardiovascular Disease. And on the surface, you're like, hospital discharges, people are going home, that's great. But I'll point you out to the footnote. Discharges include people discharged alive, dead, and status unknown. So basically, if you are not mummified and put on display in the hospital, you are included in this statistic. So what else has changed in the last 50 years? Well, it's fairly well understood now that obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease are health conditions related to diet and lifestyle. And the two probably biggest contributors, the first one is the change in our carbohydrates. And not so much total carbohydrates. If you look at this graph, this goes back to the turn of the 20th century. And our total carbohydrate intake is not that different from what it was in the early 1900s, when we were much healthier. But in the early 1900s, our carbohydrates were coming from whole food sources. And what's changed in the last 40, 50 years especially, is that the standard American diet contains far more refined and processed foods. When you refine and process the food, you strip out the fiber, which is what this graph is showing, that the percentage of our carbohydrates that come from fiber is much lower. But you also strip out the antioxidants, vitamins, and the minerals. You end up with a very nutritionally poor food. The other major change in the diet that's happened over the last 50 years that is correlated with the rise of all of these health conditions is the types of fats that we're consuming. So at the turn of the 20th century, we were consuming more animal fats than vegetable oils. And 100 years later, we are consuming not only far more total fat, but the majority of that fat is coming from vegetable oils, and our animal fat content has decreased. Now, let's face it, this would not be a problem if we were just consuming lots more extra virgin olive oil and macadamia nut oil. The majority of the oils that are being consumed are corn oil, canola oil, and soy oil. These are highly refined, processed oils, and they contain very, very few fat-soluble vitamins. The animal fats that do contain are, very, very rich in fat-soluble vitamins, we are consuming far less of. So what does autoimmune disease have to do with diet and lifestyle? What is common in autoimmune disease that diet and lifestyle might be affecting and causing an increased incidence the same way our diets are affecting obesity and type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease? Well, there's an emerging paradigm for the development of autoimmune disease that includes sort of three main categories. The first is genetic susceptibility, and that is maybe arguably a little bit different than the other diseases that I've talked about. There's a number, probably dozens, if not hundreds, of different genes that collectively increase your risk for, or your susceptibility to autoimmune disease. But your genetics only account for about a third of your risk of developing a disease. You need other things to be happening in your body as well. The other one, or the next one, is an environmental trigger. And some of these are starting to be well understood. There's starting to be a closer understanding between the link of certain infections and autoimmune disease, some toxins, some drugs. Gluten, of course, is the environmental trigger for celiac disease and is starting to be linked to other autoimmune diseases. There may be a luck component here. And when we talk about gluten as being an environmental trigger, that also brings up the question of whether or not there are any other dietary proteins that could be environmental triggers for autoimmune disease, and that is a question that we do not have an answer to right now. But diet and lifestyle is the third thing that must be broken in order for autoimmune disease to develop. Things like chronic stress and sleep deprivation have a profound effect on the immune system. Leaky gut or gut dysbiosis, or both, have been found in every autoimmune disease in which it has been investigated. This is where the old friends hypothesis fits in when we talk about disrupted gut microbiome. And this is where I want to put nutrition. I think that there's sufficient evidence in the medical literature right now to say that specifically lack of nutrition, and even more specifically deficiency in certain micronutrients, is a cause of autoimmune disease, and that it actually has to be there in order for autoimmune disease to develop, and that's what I am going to focus on. So, why do I think that nutrition has anything to do with the immune system? Well, the immune system is incredibly complex, as I will show you on the next slide. And many micronutrients are used by the immune system. But not only that, there are many micronutrients that are immune regulators. So how much of a certain micronutrient you have controls what cells are induced, whether or not they get turned on easily, and even their ability to function, their ability to perform their job in the immune system. I'm going to focus on a subset of vitamins and minerals and how they interact with the immune system. So I realize that the percentage of immunologists in this audience is probably relatively low, given the average percentage of the general population that's immunologists. So this is a subset of the immune system. It is not all of the players, but it is the best understood players in terms of the immune system. Do I press the red button? Is that the one?
Your pointer.
It's a pointer. Yeah. Can I advance the slides with it?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Which button do I press?
Forward,
Back.
backward.
Got it. Oh, you know, it actually makes sense with the symbols on there that that's what you would do. All right. Okay, so the immune system is broadly divided into two halves, the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. The innate immune system is the part of the immune system that is responsible for inflammation. So when we talk about inflammation, we're talking about the innate immune system. It is very fast to respond. It is not specific, but its job is to detect and find pathogens, eat them, and present them to the adaptive immune system. It's actually a process called antigen presentation. So this includes all kinds of cell types that are called phagocytes, like dendritic cells and macrophages. They live in most of the tissues of macrophages live in all the tissues of the human body. Dendritic cells are in barrier tissues. Their job is to sense a pathogen when it breaches those barriers, eat it, get all excited, and then show the adaptive immune system what it found. Now, the adaptive immune system is slow to get going. It takes a couple of days, but it is highly specific for the pathogen that was presented to it. And this is what allows us to fight off a disease without damaging our own tissues. The adaptive immune system is incredibly complex, but I'm going to talk about the two main players, the B cells and the T cells. B cells are the cells that produce antibodies, so clearly that's relevant to autoimmune disease. T cells are like middle managers. And they have there's a variety of different departments. So there's the cytotoxic T cell department. Their job is to find infected cells in the human body and entice them to commit suicide. There is the next department within T cells, which their job, the best known one is type 1 helper T cells or Th1 cells. Their job is to direct the cytotoxic T cells and the inflammatory cells from the innate immune system. So their job is to kind of control all of this eating of bad stuff that's happening. Type 2 helper T cells, or Th2 cells, are sort of the best known of the next department of middle managers. Their job is to control what the B cells are doing and control antibody production. And then there is a fourth really important department. In fact, you would actually probably classify this as the next level of management. These are the regulatory T cells, and their job is to turn off the immune system. Now, can you imagine if you didn't have a system for turning off the immune system? You get infected by a virus when you're 2 years old, and you'd have a ramped up immune system for the rest of your life. We need a way of turning off the immune system when the job's done, and that's regulatory T cells. They're the ones who go in and say, great job, everybody go home. So, as you can see, there's a lot of crosstalk. And if you have any one part of the immune system that is not functioning optimally, then you have the propensity to develop immune or autoimmune related diseases. And I am still walking up to the computer to press the button, but I don't have to. All right, so let's talk about these micronutrients and their role in the immune system. And vitamin A is a key nutrient. It has a variety of roles in the human body, but it's also really important for the immune system. It is required by the inflammatory cells to function. So all of those eater cells cannot do their job if there is not sufficient vitamin A. Vitamin A influences the types of T cells that are active. And this greatly affects the type of response that the adaptive immune system can mount against an invader. And probably most importantly, vitamin A is required for regulatory T cells to form in the thymus gland. The thymus gland is a very important gland for development of T cells, and it's if regulatory T cells can't form in the thymus, then you don't have those players in your body to help turn off the immune system. So not surprisingly, deficiency in vitamin A has been associated with alopecia areata, multiple sclerosis, and autoimmune hepatitis. Vitamin D is probably the best understood vitamin in terms of its role in autoimmune disease. And this comes from studies that show that the farther north you live, the more likely you are to have an autoimmune disease, and that correlates with vitamin D status. Vitamin D is essential for just about everything. The more we learn about vitamin D, the more we realize that it has its hands in every pot. In the immune system, it regulates the formation of antioxidants. It regulates the activity of those macrophages and dendritic cells. Those are like the sentinel cells that I mentioned that reside in every tissue in your body that detect a pathogen when it first enters the body. In the adaptive immune system, it again influences which types of T cells are being produced and also which types of T cells are being easily turned on. And similar to vitamin A, it is really important for regulatory T cells. In fact, regulatory T cells cannot function without vitamin D. So vitamin D, again, we know the most about this vitamin, but deficiency in vitamin D has been associated with lupus, type 1 diabetes, autoimmune interstitial lung disease, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, celiac disease, psoriasis, and inflammatory bowel disease, which includes Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. We probably don't know as much about vitamin E in the immune system. We do know that vitamin E seems to function predominantly as an antioxidant in the body, and that is a very, very important role for the immune system. We also know that it controls the development of T cells in the thymus, which I've already mentioned. In particular, it controls a part of development where the T cells are being tested for their ability to have antigens presented to them. And if they can't be receptive to antigens being presented to them, then they can't work properly. Vitamin E deficiency has been associated with psoriasis, vitiligo, alopecia areata, and rheumatoid arthritis. Vitamin K is kind of the new guy on the scene, especially because we are now starting to separate the roles of vitamin K1 and vitamin K2. It does seem to have important antioxidant activity, and it does seem to have important anti-inflammatory activity. And it hasn't been yet studied in human studies with autoimmune disease, but in a mouse model of multiple sclerosis, the supplementation with K2 showed an improvement in symptoms. Okay, so water-soluble vitamins, those are fat-soluble. The role that B vitamins have in the immune system is a little bit of a step backwards, and really it boils down to the fact that several B vitamins are essential for the methylation cycle. So many proteins in your body require methylation to be turned on or turned off, and those methyl groups that are stuck onto proteins to turn them on or off are recycled. But vitamins B6, B9, and B12 are required for that process, and if you have deficiency, then that process can't go on, and that controls many proteins that then control the immune system. So vitamin B6 deficiency has been associated with type 1 diabetes. Vitamin B9 deficiency, again, through its role with the methylation cycle, has been associated with, this is probably obvious, cerebral folate deficiency. Rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's syndrome, celiac disease, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis. And vitamin B12 has been associated with multiple sclerosis, celiac disease, Sjogren's, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, autoimmune atrophic gastritis, alopecia areata, these are fun to say, and type 1 diabetes. Minerals are also exceptionally important for the immune system. Now, iron is the most abundant mineral in the human body. You probably understand it as the backbone of heme, which is a component of hemoglobin. You can't transport oxygen throughout your body without hemoglobin. It's also the backbone of a huge family of enzymes called the cytochrome P450 superfamily. And I actually studied a member of this family for my Ph.D. thesis. This family of enzymes, a number of them have critical roles in the immune system, predominantly as antioxidants. So what's interesting about iron is deficiency in iron is actually a hallmark feature of several autoimmune diseases, including autoimmune hemolytic anemia, autoimmune aplastic anemia, and pernicious anemia. But it's also associated with a number of other autoimmune diseases, including rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune gastritis, lupus, Sjogren's, and celiac disease, and we're going to come back to that. Copper. I'm not sure that copper was ever on my radar before I started evaluating the nutrient density of my own diet. Copper has huge important roles in the human body, in particular in the adaptive immune system. It controls how effectively cells communicate with other cells within the immune system. And it also controls how quickly or slowly cells divide. And that's really important when you are mounting an immune response against a pathogen. You want your cells to be able to divide appropriately. And you really want, when you don't have a pathogen, you really don't want your cells to be dividing rapidly. Deficiency in copper has been associated with arthritis and pemphigus vulgaris. Selenium is getting a little bit more recognition. It's a really interesting enzyme, or selena enzymes, a really interesting group of enzymes. We don't know very much about them. There's about 200 that have been identified, about 45 or so in the human body. We really only understand what about 15 of them do. But there are a few that are extremely important. Glutathione peroxidase being one of the key antioxidants of the entire human body. Thioredoxin reductase being critical for regulation of redox reactions within the cell. Iodothyronine deiodinases, which I'm only saying once. These are the enzymes that catalyze the conversion of prohormone T3 to active hormone T4, thyroid hormone. So if you do not have enough selenium, your thyroid's not working, and you have really bad antioxidant status or enzymes, you don't have enough. In the innate immune system, selenium seems to be important for certain cells to get activated or turned on, and important for cell communication. In the adaptive immune system, it is essential for T cell function. There's another one. T cells cannot operate without adequate selenium. Again, it controls their ability to signal, and not just signal with other cells, but selenium is important for the intracellular signaling. So if a protein binds to a receptor on the surface of a T cell, if it doesn't have sufficient selenium, it's going to affect how that cell interprets that signal. Deficiency in selenium, not surprising because of its role in the thyroid, has been associated with autoimmune thyroid diseases, but also pemphigus vulgaris and my autoimmune disease, lichen planus. Okay, so vitamin A to zinc. This is the last one. Zinc is the second most abundant mineral in the human body after iron. And similarly to iron, is kind of involved in just about everything. And a couple that I want to point out. One is that zinc is a fundamental component of the vitamin D receptor. So if you don't have adequate zinc, the vitamin D in your body can't do its job. So your vitamin D status could be fine, but it's still not working because you don't have adequate zinc. And the adaptive immune system, zinc has an effect on the sort of maturation process of T cells and whether or not T cells are easy to turn on. And it also affects, again, this sort of signaling between the cells of the adaptive immune system. And deficiency in zinc has been associated with rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, pemphigus vulgaris, Alzheimer's, autoimmune hepatitis, pulmonary biliary cirrhosis, autoimmune thyroid diseases, which includes Hashimoto's and Graves', systemic lupus erythematosus, celiac disease, and type 1 diabetes. Okay, so clearly, micronutrients are important for the functioning of the immune system. But does that mean autoimmune disease? Because I could just as easily argue that in autoimmune disease, the immune system is overstimulated and that uses up these micronutrients and that causes the micronutrient deficiency. So which comes first? Well, it may be helpful to look at whether or not the general population is getting enough of these nutrients. The answer is no. As a general rule, most people are not consuming enough by a large margin of most of these nutrients. And this is from Lauren Cordain's Origins paper. And I'll point out that there's a few key nutrients that I just mentioned, like iron. Only 40% of us are getting adequate iron. Zinc, only 74% of us are getting adequate zinc. 56% of us are getting adequate vitamin A. Folate, only 33% of us, even though so many products are enriched with folic acid. So remember this whole diet thing, our movement to refined carbohydrates and our movement to these really vitamin-poor, high omega-6 content, polyunsaturated fat, vegetable oils. Deficiencies don't just come from our food sources, they come from our food. And studies that look at the micronutrient content of vegetables now compared to studies that measured the same micronutrients 50 years ago show that our fruits and vegetables do not have as much vitamins and minerals as they used to. And I, again, will highlight a few key ones. My favorite here is copper. So vegetables on average have 1/5 the amount of copper than they did 50 years ago. This comes from a variety of different things. It comes from the varieties that are grown, how they're grown, the quality of the soil that they're grown in, when they are picked, how long it takes for them to be shipped to you, how they are stored. This is another paper that did a similar analysis, and again, you can see, we've got a slight actual improvement in vitamin B1, yay, but we've got deficiencies in other vitamins. Okay, but showing that we're all deficient in vitamins still isn't answering this question. So I'm going to get to some very, very detailed mechanisms because this is how we're going to get at this. And I'm going to talk about celiac disease. Celiac disease is really, really special in the study of autoimmune disease because it is the autoimmune disease in which we understand fairly well the genetic susceptibility factors. We know that something like 95 to 98% of celiacs either have the DQ2 or the DQ8 variant of the HLA gene. HLA stands for human leukocyte antigen. It's also called the major histocompatibility complex. It is the protein that is on every cell that's kind of like a flagpole. And the flag that it raises in the case of immune cells is the pathogen it just ate, or proteins from that pathogen. In the case of other cells in the human body, it's random proteins from inside the cell, but it allows, if there's an infection, some of those proteins will be foreign proteins, and it allows the adaptive immune system to find those cells that have been infected with the pathogen. We understand that the dietary, or the environmental trigger for celiac disease is gluten, and in particular, it's the protein fraction gliadin. We actually also understand the antibodies that are produced in celiac disease. There are many, and there are many that are produced in subsets of people with celiac disease, but we know that 100% of celiacs have antibodies against gliadin and have antibodies against transglutaminase. There's a lot going on in this figure, so I'm going to have to sip it. So I'm not going to go through all of the sneaky ways gliadin gets across the gut barrier and into the body, destroying the gut barrier on its way and stimulating the immune system. I will say that some of these mechanisms are specific to celiac disease, potentially other autoimmune diseases, and some of these mechanisms are broadly applicable to all of us. But I will say that gliadin is very, very good at getting across the gut barrier. And we are going to focus on just probably these couple of mechanisms over here. So I mentioned that transglutaminase antibodies are formed in celiac disease. And there is a very well understood process that causes that to happen. When gliadin fragments are endocytosed by the gut epithelial cells, that means that the endothelial cell takes its membrane, wraps it around some stuff. This is part of normal digestion. Normally that stuff would then be brought into the cell in this little bubble. It's called a lysosome. The lysosome kind of digests stuff. It travels to the bottom of the cell and expels that stuff into the body. That's part of how we digest some of the things that we consume. But there's a part here where it's not completely understood. There's some of the signaling molecules are being teased out. But when the epithelial cell endocytoses gliadin fragments, this causes calcium mobilization within the cell, which puts a stress on the endoplasmic reticulum, which causes reactive oxygen species formation. Those are oxidants. The production of oxidants causes an upregulation in a specific transglutaminase enzyme called tissue transglutaminase. tissue transglutaminase is a calcium-dependent enzyme. So that means it needs to bind with calcium in order to be active. But thanks to the calcium mobilization, there's lots of it around. And this increase in tissue transglutaminase further stimulates the immune system. Now, tissue transglutaminase is one of a class of enzymes with really diverse activities that are still being teased out. But its main activity is as a post-translational modification enzyme, and it can either transaminate or deamidate amino acids, depending on the other factors, the type of protein that it's using as a substrate. And with gliadin, it deamidates it. So this increase in tissue transglutaminase that occurred because the cell took in some gliadin fragments, this transglutaminase is released into the gut lumen, or the inside of the gut. It finds all these gliadin fragments, and it deamidates it. And in this process, it forms a complex with it. It binds to it. This complex then is really, really good at binding with anti-gliadin IgA antibodies. Now, you might be wondering why there's anti-gliadin IgA antibodies hanging out here. It turns out formation of anti-gliadin IgA antibodies is extremely common. And it's not completely understood, but it might have something to do with the development of immune tolerance against gluten when we're children. Okay, so tissue transglutaminase binds with gliadin, binds with IgA antibodies, and that complex then binds with transferrin receptors in the cell surface. Now, transferrin receptors their main job is to help transport iron into the body. They're also really important for recycling of a few things, including IgA. So IgA antibodies are produced in the lamina propria, they cross into the lumen, they interact with some stuff, they then are recycled back into the body, and it's part of how the body is on patrol for what's going on inside the body. It's part of how we reduce, reuse, recycle. So this complex, gliadin fragment, tissue transglutaminase, IgA antibody, bound to the transferrin receptor, is transported into the body. That's where the immune system is. And when you get tissue transglutaminase and gliadin in this little complex presented to the immune system through the major histocompatibility complex, it seems to happen more readily in people with the DQ2 variant. You get antibodies produced against both gliadin and tissue transglutaminase. And that is the beginning of celiac disease. So what happens when you have antibodies against tissue transglutaminase? What does that do? Well, tissue transglutaminase is really, really important for a variety of functions, including keeping the matrix between cells intact. So that has an effect on wound healing, has an effect on angiogenesis, or the formation of new blood vessels. It has an effect on bone remodeling. And we're used to thinking about autoantibody production in autoimmune disease as a mechanism of molecular mimicry. We get an infection, we develop antibodies against that infection. Those antibodies happen to recognize proteins in our body. Our body's really bad at stopping those from being produced. We get autoimmune disease. Well, these anti-tissue transglutaminase antibodies also have a really high probability of cross-reacting with other really important proteins in the human body, including heat shock protein 60, which is a really important antioxidant protein, desmoglein-1, which is really important for the bond between cells in the human body. And this is my favorite, toll-like receptor 4. Toll-like receptor 4 is the receptor on the cell surface of those inflammatory cells that allows them to detect pathogens. So forming antibodies against toll-like receptor 4 means you're forming antibodies against the innate immune system. So where does, I promised I would get to where micronutrient deficiency could be a cause of autoimmune disease. And there's two minerals, two parts of this mechanism of the development of celiac disease where these minerals are deficiency in these minerals are permissive. And the first is zinc. So remember that I said that taking in these gliadin fragments caused the mobilization of calcium, which caused stress on the endoplasmic reticulum, which caused the production of oxidants, which increased tissue transglutaminase production, which, because there's so much calcium around, gets turned on. Right, just a couple steps. Zinc competitively binds with tissue transglutaminase. So calcium and zinc compete for the same binding site on tissue transglutaminase. If calcium binds, tissue transglutaminase is turned on. If zinc binds, it's turned off. So having enough zinc around is critical for then not having active tissue transglutaminase released into the lumen of the gut where it can bind and deamidate and bind with gliadin fragments. So having adequate zinc is very important. And the evidence for this in celiac disease is that deficiency is incredibly common. And when patients with celiac disease adopt a gluten-free diet without any kind of supplementation, their zinc levels return to normal. The other mineral where deficiency is permissive in the development of celiac disease is iron. Remember those transferrin receptors? I did mention that one of their normal jobs is to facilitate the absorption of iron. Well, when you're iron deficient, it becomes a natural reaction of the cells to increase the number of transferrin receptors in the cell surface facing the lumen of the gut. If you don't have iron deficiency, you don't have a need for so many transferrin receptors. If you don't have so many transferrin receptors, you aren't retrotranscytosing, there's a good word for you, you aren't bringing so many of these crazy complexes back into the body. So iron deficiency is permissive in the development of autoimmune disease, or certainly at least celiac disease. Whether any other of these important micronutrients that are vital for normal immune system function, whether deficiencies in those could be causal in autoimmune disease remains unknown, but I think is an incredibly interesting topic of study. And I think that we can say with this information that micronutrient deficiency, at the very least, if it's not a cause, it's at least permissive, that it has a permissive role in the development of autoimmune disease. I think micronutrient status is a very overlooked contributor to autoimmune disease. I think we need to be looking at micronutrients, not only deficiencies, but also excesses, because excesses can cause problems too. And also often an excess in one micronutrient means a deficiency in another. We need to be looking at micronutrient status of people with autoimmune disease and trying to fix that. Now I believe the best way to fix that is with diet and not supplementation, but that's a whole other talk. And I do think that we should start thinking of autoimmune disease as a diet and lifestyle disease. When we start looking at how important it is to have a nutrient-dense diet in order to have normal immune system function, when we start looking at how important it is to manage stress, to get enough sleep, when we look at how important it is to avoid gut dysbiosis and to support our gut microbiota in the development of autoimmune disease, I think we can start to draw some really, really concrete links to diet and lifestyle. And we should start considering autoimmune disease in the same category as we consider diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Raise your hand if your brain hurts right now. That was great. I feel like I'm gonna need to watch it like 5 times after it's recorded.
I will take questions.
Yeah.
I can go back to the slide and review.
All right, questions? I think I saw a hand over here.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Hello? I got legs. The question is, do I have any comment about interstitial cystitis? You know, I don't think that at the moment there has been a strong link specific for interstitial cystitis and micronutrient deficiency, but I do think that because it's an autoimmune disease, the mechanisms are common. There's still a loss of the immune system's ability to differentiate between self and non-self, and that comes from a loss of regulation of the immune system. So I think when you address micronutrient status, you enable the immune system to function normally, and I think that applies broadly to all autoimmune diseases. Interstitial cystitis is considered an autoimmune disease. Yes.
Interstitial cystitis is a very complicated disease, and the causes, the pathophysiology is multifold. But there is one thing that you can include in your diet that will help maintain the mucosal barrier inside the bladder and the entire urinary tract system, and that is mannose. The mannose-oligosaccharides create mucus that lines the bladder. If you get enough mannose, you can get that from different foods like aloe and moringa, are good sources of mannose. You get this essential phytonutrient for having the right probiotics inside your gut. You can Saccharomyces boulardii, make mannose-oligosaccharides. These things can help maintain the mucosal barrier and protect it. It doesn't do anything about the toxins that are actually in the urine that are causing irritation and the overall inflammation in the body. But if you address all of those things together, you can definitely cure interstitial cystitis.
Vitamin A and glycine are also really critical for barrier function.
Are there any particular issues with vegetarians and vegans with respect to micronutrient issues?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Did everybody hear that? The question was if there are any particular issues with vegans and vegetarians in terms of micronutrient issues with autoimmune disease. And the answer is yes, and I think it goes beyond micronutrients. I mean, there's some key ones that are classically deficient in vegetarian and vegan diets, depending on exactly how they're implemented, but B12, of course, is a big one. But I think all of the fat-soluble vitamins, especially A, D, and K. E is actually pretty easy to get, and easier to get from plant sources than animal sources. A, D, and K come predominantly from animal sources. And A and D are probably two of the most important vitamins at all when you're talking about the immune system. The other thing that happens with vegan and vegetarian diets, especially when you're talking about established autoimmune disease, is you actually really need protein to heal. Your body needs those building blocks to be able to rebuild tissue. And depending on exactly, again, how those diets are implemented, they tend to be too low in protein to facilitate healing. So there's sort of a nutrient density aspect. I mean, the densest source of most of these nutrients is organ meats, which vegetarians and vegans are probably not eating. And then there's the need for amino acids as building blocks. One of the things that happens when there's inflammation is you're not very good at converting an essential amino acid into a non-essential amino acid. Those conversions, which some of them at the best of the time are not very efficient, they become even less efficient when you're inflamed. Yeah.
You mentioned your preference is to kind of address these deficiencies through whole foods versus supplementation. But given that the foods are inherently less dense in micronutrients now than they used to be, even if someone was eating buckets of blueberries and pounds of kale, they still might be not getting the right amount. So where do you find the happy medium there between maybe supplementing and
That's a really good question too. Did anybody hear it? So the question was, I mentioned that my preference for addressing micronutrient deficiencies is through diet. But if foods are less dense than they used to be in nutrients, how can you actually accomplish that? So, I think it's really important as a person with autoimmune disease to seek the best, most nutrient-dense foods I can. This means for me, shopping locally. I have a local vegetable farmer who is passionate about the quality of his dirt, which to me was like awesome to meet another dirt nerd. I think it's really, really important to incorporate the most nutrient-dense foods we can. That includes a lot of organ meat. I had liver for breakfast, everybody. And I enjoyed it, I will say that. Liver and homemade sauerkraut. And shellfish and fish are some of the most nutrient-dense foods. And vegetables, I think, is really, really important, not to over-focus on protein sources, because there's so much that we get from vegetables and really highly pigmented fruits that we just can't replicate from animal-only sources. One of those really important things that we can get is fiber. Fiber and omega-3 fatty acids are the two most important dietary corrective influences on the gut microbiota. So if you're dealing with any kind of gut dysbiosis, having fiber, and I mean whole vegetable fiber, I don't mean like fiber supplements. I really don't mean fiber supplements. Fiber and a high omega-3 intake are the fastest ways to fix what's going on in there. Did I answer that question, or did I just kind of ramble? No, okay, good. If I don't answer your question, call me on it.
Quick question. Have you looked at the impact on sleep quality and situating pro-inflammatory processes?
Yeah, so in my book, I have a very lengthy section on sleep. Sleep is phenomenally important because sleep affects so many of the hormone systems that then control the immune system. And we know that people who don't get enough sleep have dysfunctional immune systems. We know they are far more susceptible to infection. Their cortisol tends to be dysregulated. And we also know that as a society, we seem to prioritize other things now, like jobs and social time and Facebook. And we as a society get 1.5 to 2 hours less sleep every night than we did 50 years ago. Or just, some quick math. I did this, I'm not doing this in my head right now, I did this before. That's a month of sleep every year. Like a month of consecutive sleep every year that we have given up as a society. Are we surprised that that has an effect on our health? So sleep is critical for healing from autoimmune disease. As a general rule, it's accepted that most of us need 7 to 10 hours a night. I think if you have autoimmune disease, you should be aiming for 8 to 9 at the bare minimum. And I can say, if you have to get up at 5, it means going to bed at 8. And that means less Facebook time. Yeah. I gave up coffee 14 months ago and I still miss it. Coffee has effects through stimulation of cortisol, but it goes beyond that. There are studies that evaluate habitual, moderate coffee consumption and show that people who have 1 to 3 cups of coffee a day have increased markers of inflammation in their blood, period. So I think that if we are a person who is dealing with immune issues, the fact that immune issues often go along with chronic stress, often go along with sleep deprivation and dependence on coffee in the morning to get us going because of the chronic stress and the sleep deprivation, that giving up coffee, especially, tea doesn't seem to have this effect, but coffee especially seems to promote inflammation. We don't completely understand what compounds are in it, although decaf is worse. So just if you think that you can get away with decaf, decaf is more pro-inflammatory than regular coffee. So definitely, it's something I think if you're dealing with autoimmune disease, coffee consumption is definitely a point to look at. That's the perfect place to end. That's the best last question ever. So the question was, do I recommend micronutrient testing? I think it's really, really important, especially if you are on medications and you are trying to heal your autoimmune disease naturally. You want to go off your medications, to do this with a practitioner, because you can't necessarily just change your diet, start sleeping more, and go off your medications. Micronutrient testing can be really instructive. I think in some cases doing targeted supplementation can be really effective, but I would prefer somebody to go, okay, look, here's my micronutrient testing. I'm deficient in zinc. I need to increase my zinc. I'm going to start eating oysters. I mean, that's what I would recommend, is that you find the zinc-rich whole foods. But I think that micronutrient testing can give you a target of what nutrients you need a particular focus on in your diet. But it's important to understand that there is a synergy between nutrients, and that deficiency in one nutrient or excess in one nutrient can actually be caused by another nutrient. I mean, the classic example is iron deficiency being caused by actually inadequate vitamin C, because you need vitamin C to absorb iron. So sometimes it's not just a question of like looking at, okay, I'm deficient in X, Y, and Z. I'm Canadian, everybody, and then taking those pills. So it's much more complicated than that, and that is where a qualified practitioner can help you really tease out exactly what's going on and follow your success, because you can overshoot. You can start correcting and go too far and then have to pull back, and that's especially true when you do supplements. I'm not a practitioner, so I don't have extensive experience with the various labs, so I can't endorse any particular one.
Okay, we're going to end there. Let's thank Sarah again.
Wait. Standing ovation, everybody. I gotta get the after picture.
Standing ovation picture.
Standing ovation. Oh, okay. That's awesome. It's going on Instagram in 5 minutes. Thank you, everybody.